Hi everyone, this is CSProfessorPam with Jumpstart Code. We are continuing our study of JavaScript. We have made a very simple application here that I want to talk about before we add on to it. Hopefully you've watched the video about variables now, and we're going to continue that discussion. So this little simple application that we created allows us to type in a name into a text box. Then when we click the button, we get an output here. And this is the basic model of most programs. You have some input that the user provides, and when you click a button to create action, then there is some processing that is done of that input and some output is generated. So when you're creating something like this, you have to start with kind of sketching out what your plan is. So we have our HTML where we need a place to type in this input, and so that's going to be our text box. Then a button, and when we click this button, we want some action to happen over in our JavaScript program, and so we connect that button to a function that has the steps of what needs to happen. And the steps involve retrieving the name and creating some output, which is going to get displayed in this H2 element. And we need to give all of these elements ID so that we can reference them. So here is the HTML that we have. It's very simple so far. There's just a header at the top. And then here is our input box that allows us to get input. The type is text. We give it an ID, which is a specific name so that we can access it from JavaScript. The placeholder text is just what we see there in the box. Then we have a button here that has an ID so that we can reference that. And we have an H2, and notice there's no content in it. This is where our output is going to go. This page is connected to a JavaScript file here using this script tag. So let's go over and look at the JavaScript file. And over here, the very first thing that we do, we need to attach action to the clicking of that button. So what I'm saying here is go to the document. I want you to go get the element that is called hello. So if we look at here, that's the ID that I associated with the button. And what I want to do is when you click that button, I want you to go to this function called say hello. So here's the definition of the function. Notice the opening curly bracket and the closing curly bracket that encloses all of the steps that are in this function. Think of this function as a subcontractor that is going to do work. These statements that start with // are comments, so you always want to have a plan. What is our plan? We need to get the name from the textbook box, and then we want to display output in the H2. So getting the name from the text box, we are going to the document, looking for the element with the ID of your name, and retrieving the value. That value is getting assigned to a variable that I've created using let keyword, and the name of the variable is your name. How can we make sure that worked? We use a console log to look at what is in that variable. And notice here, I'm printing out this string of characters, and this plus sign is actually like glue, and it's gluing together this string of characters, and then it will retrieve whatever is the value in the variable and put that together. So when we ran this, notice I have my console up. I'm going to close it and show you again. You should always right click, inspect the page, go to your console, because any error messages from your program are going to come here. And you'll notice it says your name is Pam. That is coming from this console log right here. So it's a way to tell what is in my variable. Then I am assigning the equal sign to the element on my page called that has the ID of message. I am putting text content into that element, and what I'm assigning to it is the string hello plus, remember that's like glue, the name, whatever's in your name, plus the exclamation point. And so that's why we end up with this particular output. All right, so we are going to modify this a little bit because I want to talk about arithmetic operators in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you have all the typical arithmetic operators. You have addition, subtraction, multiplication is represented using the asterisk, right? Multiplication. And division is represented using the slash. And there's one more operator that we'll talk about in a future lesson, which is the percent sign, which has nothing to do with a percentage. This is actually called the modulus operator. So again, this is multiplication. All right, but I want you to keep in mind this plus sign is addition, but we've also just seen that there are times when this plus sign actually represents something called concatenation, which is what I refer to as glue. It's sticking two strings together. And that is what we have seen here when we are using the plus sign. So keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to go make a little change to my application. I am going to also ask for your age. So I am going to add another input element. It's going to be, the type is text. The ID is going to be your age, and the placeholder is going to say enter your age. Now, I want to also point out here, it's fine if you put spaces before and after the equal sign here. It will work exactly the same way as here. It just makes your code a little more readable sometimes when you do that. All right, remember, anytime you do something, let's see what the effect is. So I'm going to save this. Let's just see what happened. You see now I have a second text box here, right? Now, here's what I want to do. When we click the button, it's still going to say, so right now it still works to say hello, but I'm going to add a second output statement. So I'm going to add another H2 element here to display a second output statement. So H2, this is going to be, the ID is going to be age. And we've got just that. All right, now let's go over to our code. And what we're going to do, when we click the button, we're going to get the name, right? I also want to get the age from the text box. So let's create another variable. I'll call it your age equal, and that's document get element by ID, your age, because that's the ID, dot value, right? Let's take a look at it and make sure we have something. I'm going to say age is your age. Okay, let's test. So over here, I'm just going to create a name, Joe, and age is 25, and click the button. All right, so look, it tells me the name, and I know that I retrieved this value because I was able to log it, to console log it, right? All right, so let's say that what I want to display in this message, I want to calculate how old you will be in 10 years, okay? So calculate age in 10 years. So I'm going to make another variable, and I'm going to call it age 10. I'm giving it that name, equals your age plus 10. Right? I want to figure out how old will you be in 10 years. Now, before I actually put my output in here, let's take a look at what we see when we console log it. All right, so let's save this. Run again. Joe, 25. Click the button. And I see something very odd here. So we saw that the value in age was 25, but somehow when I added 10 to 25, I got 2510. Why is that? Well, it's because you'll notice that even when you're displaying strings here, you don't see those quotes around it. So you can't always know exactly what is the data type of your variables here. So there is a function that can tell us that. So here, after we look at the age, I'm going to console.log type is your age, type of your age. So type of is a little helper function that will tell me the data type of a specific variable. Okay, so let me save this, refresh it. All right, so age is 25. Look at what it's telling me. The type of this variable is string, right? What does that mean? That means that what the computer sees in the variable called your age is it sees it as a string. So it sees it as if there are double quotes around it. And so then when I say age 10 equals your age plus 10, so JavaScript sees that this is a string, and it kind of does what's called an implicit conversion because it does not know how to use the mathematical addition operator between a string and a number. But it just kind of decides to say, oh, well, maybe this is a string too, and so maybe what you want me to do is glue them together. And so that's why what we ended up with was 2510. This is something you always have to be mindful of. You need to think about data types. And when you are retrieving data from a text box, it is always going to be assumed to be string. So how do we change that? I'm going to do this in 2 steps to make it a little easier to see. So I'm going to change to a number. So I'm going to say your age equals parse int your age. Right? Let's see now. I'm going to show you and then I'm going to explain what is going on here. So let's test it again, put in a value. All right, so look at what happens now. The output looks the same, but look at what it's telling me as a type. Now it's saying the type is number, and when I added the 10 to it, now I am getting what I expect. 25 plus 10 should be 35, right? So what we've just done, parse int is a function that takes whatever you pass to it and converts it to an integer, right? So when I said to do parse int, and remember what the compiler was seeing in there was a string, then it says, oh, this is a number, so it converts it to just a number. Now this is only going to work if the thing in here actually is a number, if I try to parse something like red, this is going to end up with something called NaN, which is not a number. And we'll be talking about that in future lessons. But parse int will take the value, assuming that it is all numbers, and convert it to an integer. And if you had a decimal number, then what you would use is parse float, and that will convert a string. So if I had, for example, if the user input 25.2, then this would turn into the number 25.2. We'll get into decimal numbers in future lessons. Right now, let's just stick to integer numbers, right? So that was another step that I needed to do to change it to a number. Now, I could do it in two separate steps like this, or I could do it in one step. I could put parse int here, and I just have to put my parentheses around this entire thing. It says go get this value from the text box, and whatever you get, I want you to convert it to an integer, right? And so now if I run it this way, we'll get the same thing in terms of the data type. Put another different number in there, right? So the data type is a number, and now my answer is what I would expect to be. So now that I know my answer is correct, now I'm going to put my output on my web page. So display age in 10 years. So I'm going to say document get element by ID. And I think, let's double check what we called it. I think I called that age. Yes, I did. Age dot text content equals your age in 10 years will be, and then we're going to put age 10. Let's save it. Let's take a look. Mr. Spock. I don't know how old Mr. Spock is, right? Your age in 10 years. So we have retrieved input, user input from these text boxes, and we have stored those in variables so that we could then retrieve that data after. And we've also done some math on data in our variables and come up with a different answer that we wanted to display here, right? So again, just a quick little review of the concepts that we've talked about. We've talked about attaching action to a button, and we could create a second button on this page, and I would do a very similar thing to attach different action to another button on the page. I would have another line like this, and I would attach it to a different function. So you can have multiple functions in your code. It's going to be very important for you to keep track of these curly brackets and understand where the end of things is. So this is the end of my say hello function. Right? Please use comments and also notice the indenting. I'm indenting all of the code that is inside of this function, which will also help me a lot as I start making more complicated programs. All right, and again, what are the steps? Get the user input. In both cases, I got the user input and stored them into variables. I wanted to actually do a calculation on this one variable here, and then I'm displaying output. One last thing you might wonder, did I really have to create another variable here? I didn't necessarily have to. If I wanted to put here, but I would probably want to put it in parentheses, I could put your age plus 10 in that statement. But in terms of the best way to do things when you are just learning, it is much better to really think through each individual step that you have to do, and make sure and write them out so that you can use a console log to test and make sure. Because one of the biggest problems, especially with new learners, is sometimes you think you know what's in your variables, but you actually don't. So you always need to use your console log to help you to find those problems. All right. And again, what's the best thing to do in terms of your learning right now? You should try to completely regenerate this program without looking at the code that I've given you here, right? You can always go back and reference it, but the only way that you get good and at understanding all this syntax is by typing. So that's what I would recommend, is that you try to redo this program from scratch, and it will really provide quite a jump start to your learning. Have fun.